At the beginning of the 1800s, the field of medicine became increasingly popular, as did the study of anatomy. New medical schools were established across Europe and America, and dissection became a key part of medical education. But much of the Christian Western world believed that anatomical dissection was blasphemous. The only cadavers that were available to medical schools were those of criminals who had been executed. Dissection was seen as an additional punishment, above and beyond death in the physical sense. Having their bodies dissected meant that there would be no conventional funeral and no afterlife for criminals who were sentenced to death. With an abundance of new medical schools and students, demand for cadavers soon outpaced supply, and many anatomy instructors, their students, and other unscrupulous types took up grave robbing to meet their cadaver needs. But there was another cohort of people who benefited from this booming market: serial killers. Killers like the notorious Burke and Hare, or more famously, H. Holmes, who during the Chicago World's Fair of 1893 built a hotel specifically designed to trap and kill his victims and prepare their bodies for sale. His hotel became known as the Murder Castle. In the great city of Alexandria in the 3rd century, Herophilus, now considered the father of anatomy, was afforded the opportunity to dissect and study human bodies. Herophilus made an unprecedented number of anatomical discoveries and wrote at least 9 books on the subject. Subsequent changes in Alexandrian society and its intellectual climate saw the rapid demise of the practice of dissection, and all of the books written by Herophilus were lost with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. With Greece in decline, the Romans took power, and Christianity was introduced as the state religion of the Roman Empire. Christianity continued to spread across Europe during the Middle Ages, and human dissection was considered to be blasphemous and was prohibited. By the early 1300s, anatomical dissection became more commonplace in universities throughout Europe. Only certified anatomists were allowed to perform dissections, and even then, only rarely. These dissections were presented as lectures or demonstrations, often in front of a paying audience. With the arrival of the printing press, the supply of anatomy books from Europe led to a rise in the popularity of anatomy as a field of study, and an increase in demand for human cadavers. In 1752, the rapid growth of medical schools in England and the pressing demand for cadavers led to the creation of the Murder Act, which legalized the dissection of the bodies of executed murderers. By the early 1800s, laws were becoming more lenient and executions were becoming less frequent, but the demand for fresh cadavers was continually growing. And here we join the story of 2 Irishmen living in the Scottish city of Edinburgh, William Burke and William Hare. The Edinburgh Medical School was one of the most prestigious and largest schools in the world. It had a thriving anatomy program, but the supply of corpses couldn't meet the demand. Struggling for subjects, surgeons and their assistants looked for ways to remedy the shortage, no questions asked. A few enterprising individuals took to body snatching, digging up the corpses of the recently deceased to be sold to medical schools, primarily for the purpose of dissection. Body snatching became so common that cemeteries in Edinburgh began using mort safes, cages designed to protect graves from would-be body snatchers. But Burke and Hare stumbled on an opportunity to cash in on the cadaver trade without the backbreaking labor associated with digging up a fresh grave. William Hare was an Irish labourer turned landlord who ran a lodging house in Tanner's Close in the Westport area of Edinburgh. In late November 1827, an old army veteran named Donald died at Hare's lodging house. He died owing £4 worth of back rent, nearly £300 by today's standards. Furious at Donald's inconsiderate ability to stay alive long enough to pay his debts, Hare complained about his financial misfortune to his friend and fellow Irishman William Burke. It wasn't long before they came up with a solution. Why not sell Donald's body? The pair found a willing buyer at Edinburgh School of Medicine, the renowned lecturer of anatomy, Dr. Robert Knox. Knox paid the duo £7 and 10 shillings for Donald's body, about £800 today. More than enough to cover Donald's debt and make a tidy profit. Encouraged by the ease with which they had made this money, the pair struck again in early 1828 when another tenant named Joseph became ill. Too impatient to see if Joseph would actually die from his afflictions, Burke and Hare took it upon themselves to help him along, plying him with whiskey and then suffocating him by covering his mouth and nose while he was forcibly restrained. This became their favoured method of execution, as it made it impossible to determine the cause of death and left the body undamaged, allowing them to demand a higher price. The practice became known as burking. In the absence of any further ill tenants, the pair decided to entice victims to the lodging house. Over a roughly 10-month period, Burke and Hare are said to have murdered at least 16 people, sold for between £7 to £10 apiece, although the real total could be significantly higher. Burke and Hare soon became greedy, and the pair began arguing over how the profits were split. The result was that Burke and his mistress Helen McDougall began taking in their own lodgers. On Halloween 1828, Burke and Hare's last victim, Margaret Doherty, was invited to stay with Burke and Helen. Burke's other lodgers, a couple called James and Anne Gray, were invited to stay temporarily at Hare's boarding house that evening, so Doherty could be murdered away from prying eyes. Her body was hidden in a pile of straw at the end of the Gray's bed. This was to prove the pair's undoing. The following day, the Grays returned. When Anne tried to go up to her room to fetch her stockings, Burke stopped her. Suspicious, the Grays waited until they were alone in the house, searched the bedroom, and discovered Doherty's body. Horrified at their discovery, they went off to tell the police. While they were away, Burke and Hare removed the body and took it to Knox. When the police arrived, they found the dead woman's blood-stained clothes and took Burke and his mistress into custody. The body of Doherty was identified by James Gray at Knox's dissecting rooms, which then led to the arrest of Hare and his wife Margaret. While the authorities had the body of Margaret Doherty, the medical evidence wasn't strong enough to prove conclusively that she had been murdered. As for the other victims, their bodies had been disposed of by Robert Knox. It seemed like the perfect crime. However, Sir William Ray, Scotland's Lord Advocate, had an ace up his sleeve. Ray saw that the chink in the foursome's armour was William Hare, whose unscrupulous nature could be turned to Ray's advantage. Hare was offered immunity from prosecution if he testified against Burke and McDougall. Hare readily agreed, confessing to all the murders to save his own skin. Burke and McDougall were tried before a packed Edinburgh court on Christmas Eve 1828. Burke was convicted of the murder of Doherty, while McDougall was released, as the charge against her could not be proven. Burke was sentenced to death. Burke was executed for his part in the crimes, and, in an ironic quirk of fate, found himself on the dissection table at the Edinburgh Medical School. His skeleton is preserved to this day in the Royal College of Surgeons as a reminder of the crimes he committed. Dr. Robert Knox refused to make any public statements about his dealings with Burke and Hare, but his peers and the people of Edinburgh believed he was culpable in the events. He resigned his university position and left Edinburgh in 1842. Helen McDougall left Edinburgh for Glasgow, but according to a local paper, she was confronted by an angry mob and killed. After Burke's execution, William Hare remained in police custody for his own protection. 1 week later, on the 5th of February 1829, he escaped Edinburgh, aided by the police, and his eventual fate is unknown. The Burke and Hare murders led to the Anatomy Act of 1832, which expanded on the Murder Act and gave doctors, anatomy lecturers, and medical students greater access to cadavers, and allowed for the legal donation of bodies to medical science, effectively bringing an end to the illegal body snatching trade in England. In America, however, it was just getting started. Young Herman Webster Mudgett found surgery fascinating for as long as he could remember, and after high school, he married his first wife Clara and began studying medicine at the university in Vermont, before being accepted into the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor, leaving Clara and their young son behind. Like Burke and Hare before him, Mudgett soon realized the cadaver trade offered an opportunity to make some fast money. But rather than selling cadavers to the medical school, Mudgett went the other way. He took out insurance policies on family members who didn't exist. Then, using bodies stolen from the medical school, he would stage fatal accidents and claim the life insurance. He would also disfigure or burn the bodies to ensure they could never be identified. This was the first of many insurance scams he would run throughout his life, most of them involving dead bodies. Mudgett graduated in 1884 and 2 years later moved to Chicago. In an effort to outrun investigations surrounding a number of fraudulent insurance claims and other scandals back in Ann Arbor, he took the name Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. In August 1886, Holmes visited Holton's drugstore, located at the corner of Wallace and 63rd Street in Englewood. At the time, the store was being run by Elizabeth Holden. Elizabeth's husband was ill, and she had a young child to care for. So when Holmes, handsome, charming, and persuasive, asked for a job, Elizabeth was delighted to hire him. With business booming, Holmes offered to buy the store. Elizabeth agreed on the condition that she and her family could continue to live in the apartment above the store. In a pattern of behavior that would become all too common, Holmes refused to pay his debt, forcing Elizabeth to take legal action. Then, she disappeared. Some claim Elizabeth Holton was Holmes' first murder, but there's little proof to support that claim, and records show she continued to live in the Englewood area and eventually moved to California, where she died in 1933. Holmes wrote to a woman he met a few years earlier, Myrta Belknap, and asked her to move to Chicago and marry him, despite still being married to his first wife, Clara. Myrta comes to Chicago and helps run the drugstore, but she becomes uncomfortable with the endless train of young women piling into the store to be charmed by the young Dr. Holmes. When Myrta falls pregnant, she becomes demanding of Holmes' time and attention, which makes him see her as an obstacle. He moves her to the office upstairs to manage the store's accounts, keeping her out of the way. Unhappy, Myrta takes their young daughter Lucy and leaves to live with her parents. She lives a full life away from Holmes. The same can't be said for many other women that would come into his orbit. In 1887, Holmes hatched an ambitious scheme. He purchased a vacant lot across the street from the drugstore and began construction on a mixed-use, 3-story building that became known as the Castle. The ground floor contained Holmes' own drugstore, relocated from across the street, and various other shops. The upper 2 floors were a dimly lit maze of rooms. Some bedrooms were normal, others lacked windows and had doors that were airtight. In Holmes' office, a gas jet fed directly into a walk-in vault that was both airtight and soundproof. There were trapdoors concealing metal chutes that connected with the basement, which was fitted with operating tables and a furnace used for cremations. Holmes was constantly hiring and firing different workers during the castle's construction, claiming that their work was substandard. However, the real reason was, as you could probably guess, to avoid paying his debts. An additional benefit was that with an assortment of contractors constantly coming and going, only Holmes truly understood the design and layout of the castle. He does, however, meet one workman he comes to trust and keeps him employed on the project, carpenter Benjamin Peitzel, who would later play a key role in the story of H.H. Holmes. In 1891, with the castle open for business, Holmes decided to get out of the drugstore business and sold it to Ned Connor. Ned had been working in the drugstore managing the jewelry counter. He lived in one of the rooms above the store with his wife Julia and their 3-year-old daughter Pearl. Ned and Julia's relationship was strained, and Julia had become smitten with the dapper Dr. Holmes. So Ned jumped at the opportunity to buy the drugstore. hoping his elevated status as an entrepreneur and business owner would make him more appealing to his wife. But it wasn't to be. In yet another scam, Holmes sold the business to Ned without revealing that all the stock and every fixture and fitting was heavily mortgaged. Ned had bought a business, drowning in debt. Facing financial ruin, and with his marriage failing, in no small part due to Holmes actively pursuing his wife, Ned Connor left Chicago, leaving Julia and Pearl behind. Holmes and Julia were free to pursue a relationship, and that's exactly what they did. But Julia soon fell pregnant. At this point, Holmes had 2 wives and 2 children, and had no interest in another family. It's here that Holmes commits his first murder. Holmes promised to marry Julia, but insisted she have an abortion that he, as a doctor, would perform himself. He told her that the operation would take place at Christmas, and they would marry in the new year. Julia and her daughter Pearl were last seen early in the day on Christmas Eve 1891. Soon after, Holmes approached Charles Chappell, a skeleton articulator, someone who removes the flesh from bones and reassembles those bones into complete skeletons for display. Chappell came to the castle, and Holmes told him that he had been dissecting a cadaver, not too unusual for a physician at the time, and he needed the corpse removed. He offered Chappell $36 to clean the bones and skull and articulate the skeleton. Julia Connors had been a tall woman, about 6 feet, which was relatively unusual for the time. When Holmes then sold the articulated skeleton to Hahnemann Medical College for $200, a keen-eyed surgeon remarked that the skeleton was remarkably tall for a female specimen. Later that year, Holmes' right-hand man, Benjamin Peitzel, met a beautiful young woman called Emmeline Sigrand while he was being treated for alcoholism at the Keeley Institute. Holmes was quite taken with Peitzel's description of her and immediately set to courting her through letters, then hired her as his new secretary and moved her into the castle. Emmeline Sigrand was last seen shortly before Christmas 1892. A neighbour would later report that about 7 o'clock in the evening, Holmes came out of his office and asked 2 men who were living in the building if they would help him carry a trunk downstairs. It's unknown exactly why Holmes killed Emmeline, but it's suspected that, as his secretary, she became suspicious of Holmes and his business in the castle. On January 2nd, 1893, Holmes again called for Charles Chappell. Holmes sent him a trunk that contained the corpse of a woman whose upper body was already devoid of flesh. Once Chappell had finished his work, the skeleton was sold to the LaSalle Medical College of Chicago. The murders of Julia, her daughter Pearl, and Emmeline are the 3 incidents upon which the myth of H.H. Holmes and his murder castle are built. Holmes was now on the hunt for a new victim. He thought of a woman that he had met in Boston years earlier, who now lived in Chicago. Minnie Williams was 25 years old, and to Holmes, her most attractive feature was the fact that Minnie was the heir to a large and valuable property in Fort Worth, Texas. When Holmes had met Minnie in Boston, he had been going by the name Harry Gordon, but Minnie apparently accepted that in Chicago he was going by a new name. She also accepted at face value Holmes' suggestion that she could make a huge profit if she transferred the deed to her land in Texas to a man named Alexander Bond, who just happened to be another one of Holmes' aliases. Holmes wanted to keep Minnie away from the castle, so they shared an apartment on the south side of the city. Minnie Williams may have been gullible, but she was not as silent as H.H. Holmes would have liked. Minnie wrote to her sister, Nanny, and told her all about Holmes, their marriage, and the property transfer. Nanny was alarmed and wrote to Minnie of her concerns. It was now 1893, and the world's Columbian Exposition had opened. From May through October, around 25 million people visited the fair, and it provided Holmes with a reason to have Nanny visit Chicago to both clear her suspicions and see the World's Fair. What Holmes intended, of course, was to rid himself of 2 women who were asking dangerous questions. On July 5th, 1893, Holmes got Nanny to come into his office. He asked her to go into an adjoining room to get a document for him. Holmes followed Nanny and shut the door behind her. She was in the vault, in Holmes's office. It was dark, airtight, and soundproof. Holmes waited just outside the door. Once the muffled screams of his terrified victim had stopped, Holmes left and took the train to the apartment that he shared with Minnie. He told her that Nanny was waiting for them at the castle. Minnie and Holmes returned to the castle together, and she was never seen again. At this point, however, the body count was getting too high and too many awkward questions were being asked. The families of Julia and Pearl, Emmeline and Minnie and Nanny all hired private detectives to investigate the disappearance of their daughters. And Holmes' financial debt was also becoming a problem. Much like the drugstore, the castle was fitted out with furniture and fixtures bought on credit and never paid for. Holmes was a master of dodging his creditors, but they were hot on his heels. Holmes resolved to run away to Fort Worth, Texas, and, as Alexander Bond, start a new life on the land that was waiting for him. He left in July of 1894 and took his right-hand man, Benjamin Pitezel, with him. The pair funded their trip with a variety of scams, one of which briefly landed Holmes in jail. While behind bars, he met the famous Wild West outlaw Marion Hedgepeth. Holmes had decided to run another life insurance scam, this one involving Benjamin Pitezel, and he needed a shady lawyer to make it happen. He asked Marion Hedgepeth for advice. Hedgepeth agreed to give him the name of a lawyer who could help for a fee of $500. Evading his debts was second nature to Holmes, and he never paid Hedgepeth. It was a decision that would come back to haunt him. Once released from jail, the plan went into action in Philadelphia in September of 1894. This scheme called for a corpse to be acquired and disfigured so investigators would wrongly believe it to be Pitezel. Holmes would help identify the body, and the two would split the insurance payout. But Holmes made one important change to the plan. Rather than substituting a corpse, Holmes killed Benjamin Pitezel. His longtime collaborator knew too much. The insurance company required a positive identification of the body before agreeing to pay out. Pitezel's wife Carrie, who still believed her husband was alive, had her hands full with her young family in St. Louis, so she sent her daughter, 15-year-old Alice. Holmes also told Carrie that Benjamin was in hiding and was desperate to see his family. He kept Alice with him, and he also collected two more Pitezel children, 11-year-old Nellie and 8-year-old Howard. He asked Carrie and her two remaining children to meet up with them at a later date. Seemingly, his plan was to tie up all the loose ends associated with this scam and kill the entire Pitezel family. At that point, the insurance matter looked settled, until the insurance company received a letter from none other than Marion Hedgepeth. Angry at not receiving his $500 fee, Hedgepeth revealed the details of the fraud and his belief that Holmes had killed Benjamin Pitezel. H. Holmes was arrested in Boston on November 17, 1894, but there was no sign of Alice, Nellie, or Howard. Carrie Pitezel then hired Detective Frank Geyer, who worked tirelessly to track the missing children. He found that they had stayed in a hotel in Toronto, and when they arrived in the city, he discovered a man matching Holmes' description was recalled to have rented a house at 16 St. Vincent Street. A neighbor also told Geyer that Holmes had asked to borrow a spade. Geyer and local detective Alf Cuddy visited the house at St. Vincent Street and went immediately to the cellar under the kitchen. In his book, Geyer wrote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odor became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." They then called a local undertaker for help and eventually discovered 2 bodies. It was Alice and Nellie. Holmes later confessed to murdering Alice and Nellie by forcing the 2 girls into a large trunk and locking them inside. He drilled a hole in the lid of the trunk, putting one end of a hose through the hole and attaching the other end to a gas line to asphyxiate the girls. It would be another month before Howard's remains were found in a suburb of Indianapolis. Holmes had apparently killed the boy by drugging him, then dismembered and burnt the body. The boy's teeth and bits of bone were discovered in the Holmes chimney. Following news of the discovery of the bodies in Toronto, police in Chicago opted to take a closer look at Holmes' castle. Examination of the building began on July 19, 1895, and police were bewildered by what they found. In the dimly lit maze of a structure, they found human remains, along with personal effects belonging to a variety of missing people. Holmes was eventually charged with just one murder, that of Benjamin Pitezel. He was found guilty, and after a failed appeal, he was executed by hanging at Moyamensing Prison in Pennsylvania on May 7, 1896. Newspapers speculated wildly as to how many victims Holmes had actually killed. The tabloid press suggested there were as many as 200 victims, and exaggerated the deadly features of his murder castle. Holmes himself confessed to 27 murders, but the real number of victims is probably 9. The 4 members of the Pitezel family, Minnie and Nanny Williams, Emmeline Segrand, and Julia and Pearl Connor. And some sources suggest that the odd design of the castle wasn't intended to facilitate murder, but rather to hide furniture and fittings from creditors so they could not be repossessed. However, the purpose of Holmes' macabre basement couldn't be denied. Despite the embellishments to the story, H.H. Holmes was one of America's first serial killers who used his position as a doctor and the desperate shortage of corpses in American medical schools to both hide and profit from his crimes. One of Holmes' final requests was to be buried in concrete for fear of body snatchers who might steal and sell his body for dissection. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know in the comments and consider subscribing to the channel. If you want more true crime with a touch of science, have a look at my video about the discovery of the DNA double helix and the first use of DNA to solve a murder. Thank you for watching.